Yesterday, I was going to make a video talking about George Flynn and the case with his death, but now that Minneapolis, as well as many other cities across the nation, are experiencing mass riots, or were. The National Guard was called in, and President Trump did respond and put quite a few cities. I saw a first list last night into curfew and restrictions. I don't know if those are for the night or just going to be there for a while. So many cities were experiencing mass riots, excused by venting anger for George Flynn, destroying the entire city, by the way, because there was one possible instance of police brutality. Now it looks like maybe not so much. From black people and a couple crazy liberal white people. I mean, the universities have been just parroting the media's narrative that white people are only racist, black people are only victims for well over a decade. This was not taught in the 90s when I was a kid. We had overcome anger. And then, in about 2010, when this, I don't know the exact year, but when Common Core was introduced into the schools and the universities started completely parroting the mainstream media, education, I don't know about standards, but also results started to go way down in quality. Everything made. I'm sorry, it's early. I just woke up. Everything started reversing in quality in the West. We were improving in many areas. There are several videos I'm going to link to down below that talk about where a lot of this possibly came from, the nature of a lot of this, and a lot of questions that I've been asking. Among many things, I've been very suspicious of the coronavirus shutdown from the beginning. Now we have kind of bigger problems. I don't know how the politicians, mayors, and governors are going to keep control over their cities. Quarantine control now that so many cities are ransacked and destroyed. I don't know how they're gonna build sophisticated monitoring devices when the buildings are in ruins. I guess that'll hinder that progress for a while. I'll talk very briefly about the autopsy reports on this George Flynn, and I actually feel no sympathy for him anymore. Well, he's dead, so it wouldn't matter anyway. He was a career criminal, by the way. There was some rumor that he had turned his life around. Well, not enough. So preliminary autopsy reports. Before we get to those, it's also come out that he had before, not too long ago, committed this crime, forced his way into a woman's house where he and his partners in crime, there were few people with him that night. I don't know if it was 2 or 3 or 4, but uh, so they broke into a woman's house, tied her up, and looted her house. Looted her house. I mean, I guess she was terrified she was going to be gang raped or something. I think that didn't happen that time, but the fear was real, of course. I mean, I hate saying that. Fear is real. Um, what to do about fear, of course, is always the question. Of course, once you're tied up, uh, there's not much you can do unless you can escape. But not the point. But so George Flynn had a history of not at all minor criminal actions. He was intoxicated the day he tried to. So he was arrested by the cop because he had tried to pay with counterfeit money, whether he counterfeited the money himself or just somehow had the money. Don't know, but that's also obviously no longer the point. The point is he was reported on by the store he was at. Cops were called. They confronted him. They found him to be intoxicated, and the officer was in process of arresting him. I don't want to even look up the officer's name now. I mean, he's. I'm actually hoping he gets released and protected now because what's happened in response by people who had nothing to do with the incident, these rioters and looters all over the country who are supposed to wait for information, wait for evidence and the results of the investigation to come out, ransacked, burned, rioted, looted the cities. Minneapolis, Atlanta, others, many others. Now, thankfully, I live in a much more secluded area, so so I still have. So I'm secluded from a lot of the complete chaos, but many people aren't. I wonder how things are in my home city. I don't even want to tell people which city that is. Ooh, it's actually several. I've lived in several places over across the country. Over my life, well. I mean, I feel that every progress, the good parts about the 1960s civil rights movement have not now just been completely undermined and completely been de-justified, which is not good. Which is not good to feel. I mean, it's technically not true. The people who rioted, looted, burned. I mean, they're now criminals. They have just everyone who participated in that. They're now criminals. I mean, what do you think destroying a city is called if not a crime? If not a mass crime? I mean, they should all have criminal records now. There are probably too many to give them all to. I don't know. Although the government's interestingly working on pretty high tech monitoring measures, so maybe they can review a lot of footage of them and give them all criminal records, which they would deserve, by the way. So the going back to George Flynn for a minute, I mean it's almost pointless, but I'll just finish what I was saying. Um, so I think it was Thursday, the police found him to be intoxicated. They were in the process of arresting him. The one guy was kneeling on his neck. Apparently, this is something they're trained with. The training is slightly different in each city, in each state, and autopsy reports have shown that he did not die of strangulation. So maybe the kneeling was uh, not as crushing down on him as As it looked in the video. Um, and when he did die, people were supposed to wait for reports of the autopsy, reports of investigation if any wrongdoing took place, and investigation of police training and video footage. They did not. They destroyed the cities right away, so all very they're now all very violent criminals. Everyone who took part in the riots. The reason that people with some small measure at least of rationality left in their brains were trying to say, wait for full details to be investigated before jumping to any conclusions. Whenever something like this, that the nature of the event is not clear of, is because people, without waiting for evidentiary support, thorough investigation, and the process and due process before any conclusions can be made, you get complete chaos and a return to extremely brutal tribalism. And now, the once beautiful American city of Minneapolis and several others burn into the ground because the treacherous, treasonous mainstream media has been spitting for well over a decade, perhaps for longer. Hard for me to remember since I've never watched that much mainstream media. That white people are all victims, an irredeemable racist looking to murder any black person for the crime of merely being black, which is complete and total bullshit. It's every type of shit. It's hog shit. It's horse shit. It's bullshit. Well, you get what you saw exactly what you get when this has been brewing for a while. One possible, yet not confirmed, incident of some brutality against one black person who was a criminal and who the police had a right to arrest. And I can't even be that sorry that he died anymore. Because now, after the mayor of Minneapolis said, without waiting for any of the evidence to be examined, that George Flinn deserves justice for having been murdered. I'm not sure we can consider it murder anymore, since look what happened disproportionately after that. I mean, that the autopsy reports actually suggest that it's hard to say that it wasn't. Maybe I I don't even care anymore. After the mayor of Minneapolis said, without waiting for any of the evidence, that Flynn deserves justice, for having been murdered, he didn't know that. Certainly not at the time. Certainly never can't now, because I don't think the autopsy can be conclusory about that, but it can be conclusory about the exact cause of death. That's what autopsies are meant to do, is discover that, among other details. The black community, and well, not just them, many others joined them, looted and rioted all over and torched Minneapolis and many more cities. And now, congratulations, Democrat mayors, your cities are now in ruins. Yeah. Let's go in there. American black communities have needed to clear out crime, return to traditional family values, and be good and decent people again, so that crime is rare in their communities rather than defended and celebrated. The Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson, Anthony Brian Logan, Dr. Thomas Sowell and many others have talked about this for a long, long time. And now the chances of that happening are basically nil. And as I said, the mainstream media has so much of the direct responsibility for this catastrophe to own up to. Well, the black community destroyed their city now. I mean, now literally completely, and I'm going to find it almost impossible to feel sorry for black people anymore. That's what this has done. Other than some vague chance for them having one day build happy, stable families ever again. It's basically gone. I'm sorry for that, but not for much else. Now let's talk about more of the consequences that are going to spin out of this. First of all, as I've been mentioning, the left has spent decades portraying conservatives as unholy racists and gun-happy bigots of every kind, and yet it is many, many more conservatives who are the people still with rationality left, not jumping to conclusions in regards to cases and events like this. President Trump's executive order to now counter, since there's no denying it, social media, big tech companies censoring of conservative videos and content is going to be a lifeline for conservative voices now. Well, we've definitely need President Trump for another 4 years, despite his reckless tweets and comments. Sometimes we do need him. And tell me something. How is it that rioting and destroying a city or cities helps black people in any way? How does that help? How is that going to heal and resolve anything? Well, you should know the answer. It isn't, and while there is definitely a law, there is a history of black people being marginalized in the United States. It was overcome from the 60s to the 90s. In the 1990s, when I was a little kid, we had gotten past racism. White and black children who sat together in classrooms with no problem. I don't know how that's going to happen now, seeing what's happened now. I mean, no problem with each other. Many of them were friends. Many of them hung out together with no tension. We had overcome the tension, and now it's back because the mainstream media decided to suddenly start pushing it for well over a decade. And, well, here's what happens when you do that. It was, for one thing, even worse over in the Muslim slave trade, where the Muslim slavers, for centuries, I was about to say millennia, but Islam isn't even 1,000 years old. Not exactly the point, but for centuries, took countless slaves from Africa, who, by the way, in Africa during and long before the West spent gigantic dragon's hordes equivalents of treasure and blood of their own soldiers and people, by the way, to in a Christian mission throughout the centuries, put an end to slavery all over the world. Yeah, it took a while. Sorry, it wasn't overnight. It took a while to end slavery. I'm sorry you can't change things in overnight. In the blink of an eye, it does take time. But there was a Christian mission for centuries from the West, from white Western Christians, by the way, largely. Some black Christians, some others, but largely and certainly originated with white Western Christian culture to put an end to slavery all over the world. And before that, eventually succeeded. The, uh, the tribes in Africa were catching slaves from other tribes all the time, conquering each other and taking slaves from other tribes, and then selling them on the coastal slave trades to the Americas, where they lived somewhat, uh, where they lived brutally, but at least got to live most of the time. In the Muslim slave trade, you know what the Muslims did with their slaves once they had purchased them from the African tribesmen, African traders? Well, they castrated the boys they took, made sex slaves of the women and girls, and I mean, my God! There was also, talk about the Muslims for a minute, there was a recent story from Iran where a 13-year-old girl had been beheaded by her own father for falling in love with an older man, I think 35 years old or so, a 13-year-old girl. So falling in love was planning to run away. I think then she was planning to run away from the father altogether. But she was in some relationship with a very much older man, which is very common in Islamic marriages, by the way. But this person, her father disapproved of. And let's not pretend that Muslims in Caliphate countries don't marry off the child brides to much older men than the girls are all the time. So it wasn't because of his age or her age, just because her father disapproved of the specific person she had chosen. She had tried to run away, but was caught, sent back to her father, who was absolutely without doubt intent on murdering her in an honor killing. And in the Muslim culture, this brings no consequences upon the father. And yeah, another poor child's life to add to the list of Muslim brutality. If anything like that has ever taken place in white Western culture, it has not been for thousands of years. And that's still if, which I have serious doubts on. So in North America, which is supposed to be the one continent where you can truly come to in order to escape such horrors, or was before Jar Jar Trudeau sold Canada out to the Islamic terrorists and to the communists. And there are lots and lots of communists already entrenched in American governments, who President Trump is the one person keeping them at bay from total control of the federal government. And so is the candidate who we really need to win the 2020 election, despite his reckless tweets and behaviors sometimes. He is keeping the communists out of total power and control. And so we will see what in North America can survive. I will give this advice to all conservatives in the United States, at least. Don't return your children to the public schools. Do not. Do not at this time, maybe any time. And arm yourselves, your home, and your family. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio said that New York City now needs a task force on racial inclusion and equity and minority-city responses to social inequity problems. Yeah, well, we saw exactly how those would look like now. that the media has spent well over a decade inflaming racial tension and anger. If the same people in power would have things continue the way they've been having them continue, there would be soon no more large cities left. Well, I wonder how they're going to install their high tech monitoring equipment then, when there are no more buildings. I've also learned that the governor of Maine is extending her state's lockdown almost indefinitely, or at least she has no intention of giving any idea when citizens can start returning to their lives, their jobs, their livelihoods, which is a clear breach of limits on power. And the Democratic governors, mayors, and politicians of many levels are enjoying their power. Well, their power never actually increased. I thought back in early spring we were all going to lock down for 2, maybe 3 weeks at most, and then all go back to normal. The original idea of or purpose for the lockdown all over the country, which I think was a mistake from the beginning. We should have just done what Sweden did and not ever truly lock down. Maybe some distancing and masks in the early weeks, but still kept going to businesses. Uh, Sweden is doing all right. Well, except for their uh, mass immigrant troubles, but that is a separate trouble than deciding to lock down or not. But and just shutting down for so the original purpose of the shutdown was to prevent for sometimes the hospitals and medical cares to be from being overwhelmed. That was originally the only purpose. And then we were supposed to all return to our lives. Now, restriction upon restriction upon restriction? No, I'm having none of it. That's why all I was. Well, yeah, I'm having none of it. And that's why I've effectively been, to the extent that I can, ignoring all government advice on restrictions. Past a couple of weeks, uh, the past a couple of weeks shouldn't have continued at all. But we know people in power enjoy power. There is a quote from Pokemon that from villains, from villains who are not part of the government, but might as well have been, uh, who were stealing Pokemon from. They were running this scam to stealing trainers. I don't know why I'm making this analogy, but they say something that's quite relevant to people in power. Uh, we believe in they said we believe in love power. That's because we love power. Well. This is effectively the same thing. Whenever someone who isn't using any logical population or immunology science to just extend the lockdowns indefinitely. Um, I believe in protecting your health care. That's because I love my power. So not an exact analogy. Sorry, it probably is better left somewhere else. But either way, you can kind of see. I've been questioning this from the start. You know, I have a rather shaky medical history myself, but I fought for decades to live a life of no restrictions, and by God, I am not going back to them. How about you? Well, I guess first we need to rebuild our cities, don't we? Here in Ohio, Governor DeWine began to open us up on May 1st, and I thought even that was a little late. I work at a job making parts for medical and military equipment on weekdays. So today's a weekend day. I'm off today, but tomorrow I'll go back to work. But even with that still going on for me, life is still not quite back to normal in Ohio for most people. I'm the only person in my family questioning the coronavirus excuse restriction on life. Why am I the only person in my family? Why am I the one person with the shakiest medical history, the one questioning all this? Well, maybe it's because I know what living under heavy restriction for years is like. Not exactly having no contact with family members, but I know what hell is, and this is turning into hell for everyone. I fought for well over a decade to get out of hell. I am not going back to hell. I will fight. I am beginning to buy military scale equipment, and it's not the National Guard I'm going to be fighting if it's President Trump who's calling them in to actually protect cities. It's people extending the lockdowns indefinitely, people overextending this shutdown of normal life, this inflaming of racial tensions that has now, well, look what that's led to. Those are the people I will be fighting. Screw restrictions on living one's life. We now see exactly where this indefinite lockdown, or at least what is starting to look like, very completely intended to be one, where the mainstream media continues to do nothing but I'm gonna say it again because I'm too tired to come up with a different term every time. Inflame racial tension and anger. Well, you have your results. It leads to the destruction of our cities and the atrophy of everything it means to be a human being. When rioters, looters, and arsonists ransacked Atlanta, the mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, angrily told them to stop destroying the city and to go home. So at least one person gave them the right message. When civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who I learned heavily about in school, was assassinated in the 1960s, Black Americans did not loot, riot, and destroy their city. They really were considered lesser citizens back then, although that was beginning to turn around. Now it's backstepped. They were better people back then. They were better people in the 1950s when they had stable Christian families. Everyone who just ransacked cities this past week and weekend just undermined everything the civil rights movement in the 60s and after fought hard to do. Genuine civil rights heroes would be ashamed of them. And probably after this, give up on all they were trying to do because they would have seen it futile. I don't know. Sorry. I don't know how minorities are going to ask for equity or even empathy now. They've just justified bringing. I mean, in many people's eyes, they've just justified bringing back segregation and fewer rights for minorities. Bringing that right back for a long, long time. Because you've just damaged every point, every humanitarian message the genuine civil rights heroes tried to speak. I'm sorry about that, but that is what they have done. So I think there are several other videos that people with some rationality in their brains should watch. I will link to them below. I will probably try to make another video today. I meant to post something yesterday. I got bogged down in trying to catch up with all the information going on yesterday, and I'll speak. I'll speak to everyone again when I can. This is Kestrel Raptorial. Till then.